tell the Sherpa story again. So a couple years ago when we were doing some renovation work over at Grave Peak Lookout, you know, it's in the wilderness and we wanted to respect that and do it all by, you know, no mechanized means. So we've kind of put the whole project together along with Cindy Shacker, the archaeologist, and we arranged to have a packer, the Forest Service packer, came up to Elk Summit and took all of the, so we're putting a new floor and a new roof on the lookout. And so Pete loaded everything up on 7 mules and did 2 loads, 2 trips, so 14 mule loads from Elk Summit up to Friday Pass. And that's about as far as you can take the pack string. So then he unloaded everything there, and we had these Sherpas that had been arranged. So the Sherpas were various groups. We had a couple of Forest Service employees that worked for Cindy as archaeological technicians were there, and then we had 4 people from the Selway Bitterroot Frank Church Foundation that normally do trail work, but they were committed to us for that week. And then the Iowa group, or Idaho group is what they're called. So several years ago, Connie Johnson, who used to be the wilderness ranger at Moose Creek in this part of the world, she came here from Iowa. She was a school teacher in Iowa, and she came out west and loved it and ended up working out here for the rest of her life. But she started this thing where she would bring these school kids from Iowa that had never seen anything but cornfields to Idaho. And they would spend a week, and put them to doing trail work or whatever.
Introduce them to elevation.
And most of them had never been on an airplane before. Yeah, by far the highest elevations of any, you know, that ever been. And so these were kids in like, I don't know, maybe like between their freshman and sophomore year or sophomore and junior year or something like that. And they'd come out and do these like 10-day trips and then have to write all about it to get some school credit and things like that. But so we had this group of kids from Iowa, and so the 14 mule loads, we started splitting them apart, breaking them down, and making backpack loads out of them. And you know, the Selway Bitterroot guys were taking some pretty heavy loads. Anna Bankston, the wilderness ranger, was taking some pretty heavy loads. Jen, the archaeologist, you know. Anyway, so they're starting to haul this stuff up. Well, it takes 38 loads to get all of the shingles and flooring and new floorboards for under the subfloor, all of this, you know, and it's all 6-foot long boards, you know, and they're on a backpack, so they tried them diagonally and they tried them vertically, and you know, you got a 6-foot board on your backpack, it's about 4 feet above your head, and they're catching them on tree branches and everything else. But over the course of the week, they packed all of it up to Graves Peak. And some of those Iowa kids, you know, and so to complicate matters, the last part of the trail was a big snowfield. There's about 200 yards of just rotten, icy snow that you had to cross, and the trail was somewhere under it, like 10 feet below. So with all these loads, they have to like go across this snowfield. Well, some of those kids were just terrified of heights and everything else, and could not, like, it took all day to convince one girl, not even carrying anything, to just cross the snowfield and come up to the lookout. But she made it, you know, and it was a big deal to get her up there by herself. But I remember one kid came up and was like, "Here's my load," and he handed me 4 shingles. That's what he'd carried, but hey, he contributed. That was good enough. Well, about halfway through the project, we decided we needed another extension ladder, and Connor, the Selway Bitterroot guy, the trail leader for them, he's like, "I'll go get one." And so he just takes off and runs the 5 miles down to the trailhead while they were driving one up from Powell, picks up a 16 or 18 foot extension ladder and backpacks that, not from Friday Pass, but from Kuskoski Meadows, the whole 5 miles and 3,000 vertical feet.
Wow.
And we had the ladder that afternoon.
Oh my gosh. These guys know how to work.
Yeah.
Oh,
So then, you know, we're working on the lookout, and there's not a lot of space up at Graves Peak. It's like pretty much about 3 feet by 5 feet in front of the door, and the rest of it's a cliff. And so we didn't want everybody up there. So the Iowa kids got to go camp down at the lakes, Wind Lakes, and the Selway Bitterroot guys spent the rest of the week and totally rebuilt that last section of trail from Friday Pass up to the lookout.
Oh, wow.
Cut it all out, redid a whole bunch of grade. You could actually get a mule up most of the way now because they worked on it. And then at the end of the week, they were there to help us backhaul all the garbage and the, you know, our tools and the stuff that we didn't need. And they hauled it all back down to Kuskoski Meadows for us. And,
Wow.
anyway, that was the Sherpa
How long
story.
did that take?
It took them about 2.5 days to get everything up to us, but you know they brought bundles up the first day, so we
Okay.
could start on the roof and get going.
Yeah.
You know, and then they just kept bringing more materials. And we finished the roof, and by then all the flooring was up, and we started on the
Oh
flooring.
my God.
So the whole thing, how long did that last?
We were there 1 week.
You got
That's
all that
it?
done?
Yeah,
Wow.
1 week.
Wow. That's impressive.
Yeah, and it was, you know, we couldn't have done it without all that help. But yeah, it was a great project. Did it completely in the wilderness. We had not a single power tool, not even a battery powered anything.
Really?
So every one of those floorboards, every one of those shingles, it's a hip roof, D6 double hip roof. Basically, you got the hip roof on the cupola and then hip roof below that,
Yeah.
which gives you a lot of corners that you got to cut.
You did it all by hand.
All with a handsaw. We had one of those little Japanese pull saws, and I think I Leaf cut 2 or 3 shingles and then handed me the saw. And yeah, for 3 days I cut shingles. There was over 500 hand saw cuts to get that done. Whoa. And then the flooring, Leaf had found somewhere at like a pawn shop this old mechanical floor nailer that is kind of similar to the more modern pneumatic ones, but this thing was all mechanical, and you just whacked, you know, it had a big rubber thing on top, and you hit it with a rubber mallet until it fired. So you're like building tension on this big spring until you hit it hard enough and it had enough, and then it would drive the nail. Or, you know, there was a special kind of these dart-shaped nails that hold really well. But so, you know, that was mechanical, but not motorized or
Right.
air
Yeah.
compressors or anything else.
Was it heavy though? I would have thought it
Oh
was.
yeah, but the Sherpas carried it up.
Who cares if it was heavy?
We have Sherpas.
And he found this thing at like a pawn shop, but then it took him like a year to find nails for it, you know, because nobody does that anymore.
Oh.
But he finally found a supplier of the nails.
Do it.
Yeah, and then, you know, so it had, there was 1x8 shiplap subfloor, and then the original floor on top of that was the tongue and groove vertical grain fir flooring. It's about 3 1/4 inches wide. And then on top of that, there was a layer of oak hardwood flooring that had gone in sometime after, you know, the original lookout. But when we were taking it all out, you know, most of that there was holes all the way to the rocks, you know, through about a third of the floor. The subfloor and everything was gone.
Wow.
But, you know, as we pulled all that out, we salvaged enough of that old oak flooring to redo the cupola floor with oak.
Oh.
Oh, that's
So
cool.
that's some of
That's
the, It's
original.
not original but it's
Okay.
whatever, you know, probably one of the renovations from the 50s or something when they put that oak flooring in there. And the cupola floor is still that. Yeah, so we're still ongoing up there. It was built in 1923, so it's 100 years old here in another year or so. And
Yeah, it is.
the plan was to have it fully restored and completely done, and then COVID shut us down. We couldn't work on it last year. We have to re-level the building to get the window opening square again. You know, one corner of the building dropped 4 inches, so all of the window openings are kind of trapezoids like this, which broke all the glass, broke the frames and everything. But all of the wood of the frames and everything is there. We really don't think we have to replace any of that old original wood. We just have to replace the glass. And some of the glass is still there. It's the old ripple glass from the 20s.
Oh, wow.
Oh, cool.
But yeah, that's kind of, you know, ongoing project is to get the cupola windows in and then start on the bottom lower level windows. It's a 12 by 12. It's a little smaller than a lot of the lookouts, but that was the standard back in the 20s. And the other cool thing is we pulled the old roofing off. You know, it had old shingles that were just in horrible shape. You know, most of them gone. There'd be little splinters of shingle this wide held with one nail, you know, and it's just bare for 2 feet on either side of this little splinter. Well, so we started pulling all that off, and there was a beautiful layer underneath them that were stained green.
Oh.
We're not sure they were original, but they've been protected by this other layer, and they were actually in pretty good shape. And it's just like they replaced the roof at some point and just nailed them on top of the old shingles because it was like due, but not so much that they were worn out. It had just been enough years that they thought they needed them on. And so those were still under there and
That's
still
pretty cool.
stained green and had been protected by the new layer, and it was cool seeing all that.
Yeah.
Then as we stripped that layer off and got down to, it looked like brand new pristine tar paper, but that was, 98-year-old tar paper basically.
Wow.
And we pulled that off, and underneath it, so it's the hip roof going up, and all the ends are cut, and every board is a different length as you're coming up the roof, Those were all labeled in order, north, south, east, west, and numbered for their position on the roof. And on one of them, it said Bell, solo. Well, Bill Bell was the ranger up here in the 20s. That had a lot of history at Elk Summit. He's the famous ranger from The Ranger, the Cook, and the Hole in the Sky. That Bill Bell that had the big fist fight in Darby and all that stuff. And here's his name on the roof underneath
That's
all those
very
layers
cool.
of shingles.
Oh,
Bell,
wow.
solo. Cool.
Yeah.
And his name is still on that board underneath the new tar paper and the new shingles. It's there. It'll be there for 50 years the next time somebody takes the roof off.
Okay, yeah, so it could have been either that they took the roof off and then put it back, or they built it down below, right? And that's why it was all numbered.
That was the
to take it
confusing
up?
part about graves is as we took it apart, as we pulled that old roof off and saw that every piece was numbered and it appeared to be pre-cut, like a kit.
Mm-hmm.
But Cindy thought that the kits didn't come into, the standard kits that you could just order a lookout and it'd be shipped on a rail car and there's your lookout, didn't come till later. So there's several explanations of what could have possibly happened there. Number one is they just built it in the ranger station in the winter, numbered everything, took it apart, and sent it up, and it was pre-kits, but it was kind of a prototype kit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which that would meet the time frames, or the time frames that we have documented for when kits were available were off by about 5 years, and they actually were available sooner. We don't know.
Yeah.
But the whole thing was packed up. There's 2 boards in the entire lookout longer than 6 feet long. Everything's spliced together with shorter pieces that came up by mule.
Wow.
Cindy's got some documentation. They used to have a Bill Bell packed a sawmill, all of the running gear and everything for a sawmill over Blodgett Pass on mules, and had a sawmill at Elk Summit. And you read about it in The Ranger, the Cook, and the Hole in the Sky. He brags about, I saw it done. Bill
Wow.
Bell, 80 head.
Wow.
Pack string of 80 head over Blodgett Pass.
Wow.
And, that's worth bragging about. Everything moved by mule. And, when you're trying to keep an entire ranger district running by mule coming over Blodgett Pass, that's how everything came into this country. And you had all of those employees in here that need fed. Everything had to come in by mule, and they got good at it. In the 20s, that was the way in here. Lolo Pass wasn't a road. There was a trail that way, and then if you came over Lolo Pass, you still had to get across the Locksaw to come up here. This was a game preserve. There was no hunting allowed up here. Back, in that time period. But right over here, at the upper end of Big Sand Creek, is a creek called Poacher Creek, because the guys from Hamilton would come up over Blodgett Pass and poach in Idaho in the game preserve. And there's some old stories of rangers tracking, coming out here and trying to catch some of these poachers and spending 3 or 4 weeks on snowshoes in the winter, chasing after them and always about a day behind and never being able to catch up to them. And they were getting warned out by... It's like the whole community was making sure that the poachers didn't get caught, and the rangers were just fumbling around out here all winter long looking for them.
I kind of got the idea that rangers weren't well respected.
Right, and then, Norman McLean writes about that in his book, that the ranger basically had to be the toughest guy in town. because he was probably going to have to fight every other guy in town. And you know, it's a great book that he wrote there, and John McClane, Norman's son, has said that the stories that Norman wrote about all happened, but they might not have all happened in 1 year. You know, and the way he wrote the story is just like all these things happened in this one season, 1919, on the Elk Summit district, and you know, in actuality, those were probably over a couple of decades.
Yeah.
But it makes a great story. The story is called The Ranger, the Cook, and the Hole in the Sky. They made a movie out of it, which I'm very disappointed they didn't use Elk Summit Ranger Station. They filmed it in Canada. Yeah, it's right there, as is. But it was filmed in Canada. And
Of course.
it's not available. The movie's available separately. But the book was part of A River Runs Through It. It's A River Runs Through It and Other Stories, and it's one of those other stories.
Oh.
So if you're looking for the book, The Ranger, the Cook, and the Hole in the Sky, you got to find one of those early editions of A River Runs Through It and Other Stories, and that's where it's at. How many people don't associate that story with, you know, Grave Peak here and Elk Summit here, which is still right here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Down at Elk Summit Ranger Station, the old building there that's now the tool shed or the wood shed, that was the Ranger Station building in 1919. It was built in 1910.
Oh, wow.
And it's still there. And we did a bunch of work on it that same year, and we've done 2 or 3 years worth of work. Kathy with the Historic Preservation team came over. The building had racked out of square, so that if you hung a plumb bob from the eave, it was 14 inches from the
So it was going
foundation. So it's tilted like that. And we pried and jacked and come along and straightened to where it's still lists a little bit, but it's a lot straighter than it was.
How long did
We
that
got the
take?
doors to open again and the windows to
Cool.
open again and redid it. Kathy took the old window sashes. There was 2 that were still good, and she was able to duplicate them perfectly with, and they're all, you know, rebuilt windows. And we pulled some old boards out of the Elk Summit building that had been part of the ceiling, and they were just trapping pack rats and stuff up there in the ceiling. So those came out, and they're circle cut boards, which were probably milled on the Bill Bell's mill. And those became the new trim around the windows and stuff in the original Wanigan cabin from, you know, it was built in 1910. It's the oldest building on the Clearwater Forest, and there it is, fixed up. And building, the tool shed was the original one. And then in 1927, once they had the sawmill in here and everything, they built the big cabin.
Okay.
That's the station down there now. But if you go in there, you know, go in and say hi to Bill. But look at the ceiling, and it's circle sawn boards. And they didn't waste a single one. There's a couple that are just like slab edges, but they used them. And then at some point it had a hardwood floor put in, you know, on the main floor, but upstairs it's still the original, you know, boards from 1927. But, and he talks about how Bill Bell's trail standards were better than everybody else's, and they were, you know, it was like, why, you know, it's not like we're building a highway, but we're building some awful nice trails. Well, Bill Bell could take 80 head of stock on those trails he built. And you look at that trail between Elk Summit and Blodgett Pass, and it does seem to be better graded and a better quality trail. You know, it hasn't had 100 years of maintenance, but just the layout of it and where it goes and what it avoids and what it, you know, it was very well laid out. And, you know, it just reminds me of that story that they were building these premium trails, and there's an example of it.
Yeah.
So where was his territory? Because I want to hike his trails.
So the trail, well, Elk Summit Ranger Station down here, that was their ranger station. That was the whole
so everything
district.
kinda out
And it
of
was
here?
the Elk Summit district.
Okay.
Powell was a separate district, so somewhere out here about Savage Pass was the edge of their district. So basically this basin you're looking at right here was their territory.
Okay.
And you know, the district, there was
Hike a few.
hundreds of districts compared to today. One ranger had one little area, which now this same piece of ground that has a single ranger now would have had 12 or 15 rangers back then. You know, there was just, and it's what they could patrol by horseback. So, and you know, Elk Summit went out to Hamilton. Powell went out to Hamilton in the winter, but there was all these different districts up here and stuff. You know, and I don't know if there was more people. You know, the population's obviously bigger now. There was more going on out here. as far as, so after 1910, you know, that's when the Forest Service thought, if we're going to get into this fire game, we're either going to burn down the whole West like we did in 1910 and towns and 87 people died and all that stuff, or we're going to get after it. And so they started actively, forest management went to suppressing fires. And to get to fires in time to put them out, you needed a trail to get there. You needed trails to get the supplies there that you needed for the fire, to get the people there, to get all of the food, you know.
Yeah.
There was no caterers or anything like that. It all had to, you hired a cook and sent him in with the pack string, and they had food for 100 men and would cook it right there. So they were, you know, from 1910 up until basically through the Depression, the CCC guys started, and they were building tons of trails, and that was all to just get people where they needed to go to put the fires out.
Wow.
And they started building lookouts in the 20s and then all through the 30s. You know, they basically wanted a smoke chaser on every high point, and they gave him a house to live in to keep an eye on things, and when he spotted a fire, he called it in and headed to it. And his job was to spot them and put them out. And if it got to where the next lookout over could also spot it, you might get some help tomorrow. But otherwise, it was solo. You know, all the smoke chasers just ran with pretty minimal gear. There's some old videos that the Forest Service did in the 50s about, you know, one's called Smoke Chaser John, and it shows him leaving his lookout and jumping in a pickup and driving for the first 8 miles, and then it's off onto the trail with the backpack for 3 miles, and then it's time to hit the brush, and he heads up the hill. And these are old black and white. Here in the wilderness,
how do they
there's
maintain-
still a wilderness trail crew that
Okay.
kind of makes the rounds, but they've gone from having every district having, you know, like a 15 or 20 people on trails to the entire central zone might have 4.
That's-
2,000 miles of trail with 4 people.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
So the odds of getting to it even annually is,
Yeah.
it's not happening.
Almost nothing, yeah.
And then a lot of the money has gone to outside the Forest Service groups like the Sally Bitterroot Frank Church Foundation. That's a private foundation that funds their own crews, and the Forest Service gives them some money. Like budgets that used to go to our own trail crews goes to them, and it provides more people actually. And they do a lot of the work. A lot of the keeping the trails open and things like that are being done by these foundations. And they do it all over, you know, the Selway Bitterroot, but also the Frank Church. They have kind of two units of that organization. One works out of the Frank Church and the Salmon and McCall area, and then the one's up here, you know. But they helped us Sherpa the stuff up to.
Oh,
Oak
that was
Summit.
who the Sherpas
Yeah, that was 4 of the Sherpas worked for that organization, and all of these trails out here are maintained by them, more
Okay.
or less now. Yeah,
And
and at the end of the year they do their annual report, and it's kind of neat to read, you know, because you got 4 or 5 guys out there, and they use a lot of volunteers and things. They have some interns, but they're working all summer, hitch after hitch after hitch. Well, then they do this annual report, and it's just like they counted every single tree. You know, it's like we cleared 966 trees this year. So the year there was, you know, and with all these fires we've had out here, you have a lot of snags and stuff blows over. So when we had Connor and the other Sherpas helping us over there, they had just cut out the trail to Big Sand Lake the week before. Well, so we were working on this project up here at Diablo the week before I went over to Great Peak, and so I just got the bright idea. I always wanted to go to Big Sand Lake, so I finished my work here that week and took off with my pack and went to Big Sand Lake cross country right here, which I would not recommend that because there is no trail and there never has been, and it's burned, and so it's just brush and snags.
Yeah.
But then coming back out, I could see that trail had been freshly maintained. I mean, there was horse tracks on it, stock had been through, and there was tons of fresh cut logs where you could actually, you know, the pile of sawdust is still right there and it's white, and you know, it hasn't really even rained on it. And so I knew it had been recently maintained, but then there was just tree after tree after tree over it. Well, they'd had a windstorm the week before, So the trail, the Selway Bitterroot crew had cleared that whole trail, every single tree.
And
Got
that was
wind
fun.
for 3 hours, and there was over 100 more trees.
Oh,
across the
you've
trail.
got to. Oh my god.
It's gotta feel like
they
a never
did
ending.
Graves
Wait,
Peak.
did you count them?
Yeah. They did Graves
Wow.
Peak, and then the following week they had to go
Back.
cut out the Big Sand Creek Trail again.
Oh,
Oh my.
And they had a bunch of people from the Sierra Club from California. Like, these are like the top people
Militants.
of the Sierra Club had come out to do, to volunteer and help them out. So the Sierra Club did a write-up about this hitch that they did to Big Sand Lake and said it was the hardest trail they'd ever done. The toughest work they had ever done. And that was 1 week's worth of blowdown. So when I was working my whole career, I worked in Helitac and got to ride around a lot in helicopters, going to various, there's always a reason to go somewhere. But that's how I got to go to every single lookout. Some of them you can drive to, and I did that, but they get every lookout gets inspected. It's supposed to be every 5 years by the forest engineers, and it's just a condition update. Well, this stuff out here in the backcountry, they could send an engineer with a mule team and be gone for a couple of years, or they just throw them in a helicopter for a day and we go hit 10 of them a day.
yeah.
Oh.
And,
Wait, you got to do that?
so I got to do that.
Dude,
That's so
cool.
cool.
My job's to open the door and let the guy out and put him in. But that's how I got to every single one of them.
So you've been to every, Idaho lookout? Or every lookout
Just on
period?
our forest. On
Okay,
the Nez Perce
still
and
though,
Clearwater.
that's,
Yeah.
how many is that?
Oh, 60 or 70 probably.
Oh, that's so cool.
Seriously, what's your
Flying
favorite?
over lookouts.
What?
What's your favorite?
Graves.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that's because you went and visited as a kid.
And it's unique and it's beautiful, and the lakes. I mean, there's
Okay.
an unnamed lake. You got Wind Lakes off this side, Colt Lake off that side. Just a bunch of unnamed ones.
How old were you when you went to Graves?
16 or 17.
Okay. Had you been to, was that your first lookout?
That was my first lookout.
Okay.
Yeah.
What kind of condition was it in then?
I don't remember there being holes through the floor that went all the way to the bedrock, so I think it still had the floor in it then.
But it was rough.
Yeah, it's, and it's, the interior is the original paint, which I'm sure is lead.
Oh. Don't lick it.
Yeah,
It's
don't
flaking
lick it
off
off.
like crazy. There's flakes of lead paint all over the floor up there. But, prior to us getting there in 1984, a lot of other people had been carving their names in the walls, so that was just a natural thing for us to do as kids. And there's a lot, now.
I bet that's like a history lesson in
Yeah,
itself.
there's
though,
one
reading
guy up there
walls.
that carved his name on the wall in 1969, and
Wow.
and then dated it every time he's been back, and he was
Oh,
last
wow.
back in 2018.
Really?
Wow.
He was there in 1969 and 2018.
That's-
And he was involved in some of the work that got done in 1996 when Leaf was rounding up people to help on it last time. He wanted to come back, because he's in his 80s now. But he was ready to go back to Great Peak and work on it again.
That's awesome.
Wow.
It was there just the year before we fixed it up.
Yeah.
We fixed
So
it up
when
in
you guys fixed up,
1919.
you didn't mar any of that?
Oh no, it's all
Okay,
there.
then, cool.
There's
Oh, 'cause
hundreds
they
of
told us,
signatures
yeah.
on the walls
Cool.
over there.
Very cool.
But yeah, mine's on the edge of a shelf. This is Nathan Raff, because I didn't go by Nate then. Nathan was my name, and Nathan Raff, Kuski, Idaho, 1984. He's carved in the edge of that shelf. I was there with my younger brother who's passed away, and so I looked. I'm pretty sure he carved his name in the wall too. We all did. The
Yeah.
whole Boy
Yeah.
Scout troop did.
Yeah.
And I looked all over that place trying to find my brother's initials or anything like that. Well, I didn't find my brother Quinn's name. But I found my other two brothers. I think they were both there in 93.
Okay.
One's LDR, Lance, and then Eric. I think Eric did his, Eric Roth. And
Okay.
it's like they started and then they got yelled at, or they were told it was time to leave because it's finished with a pencil.
That's
But
cool.
it is kind of neat seeing the one from 1969 and then all those other dates, and it's part of history. Kind of we're discouraging people to do it now because you kind of have to write on top of somebody else's name.
Oh.
So that's why we put the register books.
Yeah.
We pulled the register book out to update it. It was it had some documentation from the '96 stuff in there, and we wanted to put it that it was recently refurbished. And then we'll put it back up there with a big register book so people can sign the register, and then maybe they won't sign their name on the wall.
Do you get many visitors here?
It's hit or miss. I've been up here some years and not had a single visitor. And this trip, well, it's hunting season, so the hunters come twice or 4 times a day. But even Chuck, the guy that replaced me, had more visitors this year than he's ever had. Your guys are, let me see, had 6 that first day. The hiker was 7.
Okay, that's more than already than I would have thought you would have had.
Yeah, you guys are 8 and 9, and the Packer and Evelyn tomorrow.
It's more than I would have expected.
Okay, so
Last
it's not
year
a voice
I
actor,
had
but-
6, and that was COVID. With they walked past 5 signs of the lookout is close to the public, and you're not allowed to visit, and I still had 6. You couldn't come in,
Yeah.
right? They could come up, and we were not supposed to let them even on the catwalk.
Right.
But I'd stand out there and talk to him a little bit, and then I'm like, okay, I'm going inside and closing the door. You guys can come up, and walk around the catwalk, and take pictures. It's only 5 more or whatever, 10 feet up higher on the ground, but the pictures are better off the catwalk. This is my crazy lookout story, and some of the Facebook pages they ask, what's the strangest thing you ever saw at lookouts, and there's a lot of UFO stories and Bigfoot stories and things you're not even sure are true. Well, here's my story.
I like it
So I
already.
was volunteering over at Hoosier Ridge, which that's on the North Fork of the Clearwater District, and it was actually the first lookout I ever helped staff or work on when I was, my first year on in the Forest Service. They had a lookout up there that pretty much insisted on working 9 to 5 and wanted days off.
Heaven forbid.
Right, So her days off were my days off, and so they would pay me overtime to go sit in the lookout because the person they'd hired to do the job didn't want to.
Wow.
And so, I was a rookie and knew absolutely nothing about anything, but I could go sit in the lookout and read a book and watch for fires.
Yeah.
So Hoosier was kind of, that was the first place they ever got to sit for 2 days at a time. And they've had a hard time keeping that one staffed. It's not the most scenic. It's beautiful. All lookouts are beautiful, but they were having troubles with the trees were growing up too tall and couldn't see anything anymore. The trees are taller than the tower. So they did a big clear cut. They cut a 1/2 mile of the ridge, and so you're basically just sitting on a tower in the middle of a clear cut.
Oh wow.
And it's not pretty, and people don't like it. And it's, there's ATV trails all over the place up there. So, the longest I volunteered up there, I did 23 days one year, and I had 87 visitors.
Whoa.
And 1 did not arrive by ATV.
Wow.
1 walked out. He was scouting
Yeah.
moose hunting and swung up to the tower off the trail.
Wow.
But everybody, there wasn't even pickups. They
Wow.
they all come by ATV. And so, it's a little overwhelming at times.
Yes.
Yeah, you'd have people lined up. It's like I can, 4 people at a time was about the max I wanted.
Yeah.
On the catwalk or in the tower. And there'd be 6 waiting on the ground to come up when those 4 came down, And you'd go days where there wouldn't be any, and then a weekend would come and you'd just be overwhelmed. And it was amazing how far some of them had come. Like I had one guy come in about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I'm like, where are you from? He's like, Coeur d'Alene. I'm like, where'd you start? And his truck was parked at Calder on the St. Joe River that morning.
What?
And it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon. He still wanted to go all the way over to Cayuse Landing airstrip, which is still several miles across, from Hoosier. You still got to go down and cross the Kelly Creek and up the other side over East Saddle.
He had some miles to put in.
He's not going to get back to his truck till 2 in the morning.
You don't have a coat. You don't have a sleeping bag. You don't have any visible food or anything. And you're looking at it somewhere around a 300-mile day. I don't see any gas jugs or anything. If I were you, I'd turn around immediately, and you'll probably run out of gas 100 miles short of your truck.
What did he do?
He turned around.
Did he?
I
Okay.
convinced him not to try to go on over to Cayuse. And basically I said, if you turn around now, there's other traffic on that route. If
Yeah.
you go to Cayuse and run out of gas over there, it might be, hunting season before somebody finds you.
What? People just don't think.
Yeah,
That's crazy.
yeah. 300 miles,
Yeah.
no spare gas.
No spare
No
gas.
nothing,
Yeah.
no nothing.
And I wonder if somebody told them not to drink the water.
So because it gets so much ATV traffic, the district, it's hit or miss. To me, part of the job of being a lookout is interacting with the public and explaining things and, why we do what we do and why everything's burned out in the wilderness and why lookouts are still viable versus air patrol and, it's part of the job. So I'll leave the gate open and they're like, if you get overwhelmed, close the gate. We don't care. You can close and lock the gate if you want. I'm like, no, I'll leave it open. I don't care.
Yeah.
Well, you're used to seeing visitors, and about the earliest I'd ever had a visitor was 7:30, 8 o'clock in the morning, and I love to watch sunrise, so I'm up at dawn no matter what time of year it is, and it doesn't bother me if somebody shows up fairly early. Well, because it's fairly early when I get up, I go to bed as soon as it gets dark too, and so I'm sound asleep one night in Hoosier Ridge. It's a Saturday night, just dead to the world, middle of the night. It was probably around 2:33 a.m. I hear vehicles, and the entrance road's a couple miles long. You can see, so I roll over and look out, and yeah, there's lights on my entrance road. Quite a few lights actually, and they're spaced out. It's really dusty, so it's like a quarter mile or more between each vehicle, but there's a lot of people coming up. I'm like, well, the lookout hasn't been staffed every year. It's kind of hit or miss when it's open or not open, and they might not even realize that somebody's up here. So I turned my light on, just so that, in the middle of the night, here's the lit up lookout. So the first vehicle comes to the edge of the clear cut there, and it's about a quarter mile down the road, and he stops because he can see the light. And the next vehicle catches up to him, and it's like they chat for a little while. Well, then they keep coming, and more keep coming, and more keep coming, and so it's the middle of the night. It's pitch black everywhere, and they've all got these big LED light bars plus the vehicle lights going. There's music just cranked, like it's probably
You could
what
feel
woke
it?
me up. I could hear the bass from 2 miles away, boom, boom, boom. Anyway, and they just keep coming. Well, there's about 30 of them. And they all come roaring up to the tower and then circle like old Conestoga wagons on the helipad. So they all circle out on the helipad with all their headlights pointing inward. And there's just vehicles everywhere. And it's the middle of the night, and the music's going and everything. And I'm like, what the heck, And then, so one guy peels off and he comes roaring up, not on the road, he's like driving out through the clear cut and running over stumps and down logs and the trees we've planted, and he comes roaring up the backside of the tower and comes by and parks next to my truck. And it's like he's checking it out or something like that, and I've got Idaho plates and Idaho County plates or whatever, and he goes roaring back off to report what he saw, I guess, or something anyway, but I'm sitting up there with my light on. I got out of bed, got dressed, figured somebody might come up the tower, sitting there with my light on. Can't really see what's going on because it's just headlights everywhere out there. Well, all of a sudden, boom! And they start shooting. I don't know what they're shooting at. So my light went off real quick. And they had several different guns. They had ARs because you could count 30 rapid fire, full magazine out of an AR over and over. And then like pistols, like I'd count 14 or 15 shots. I don't even know what they're shooting at. It's pitch black. It's the middle of the night. And there's just rounds going who knows where.
Wow.
And I'm like, what do I do? I mean, even if I get on the radio, help's 5 hours away. Nobody's going to get here. I don't even know if dispatch is staffed in the middle of the night,
Yeah.
you know. It is when there's fires going on, but there was really nothing happening. So I'm like, they won't even know. I'm like, okay. If a round hits the tower, I'm calling on the radio because it's recorded, at least in dispatch.
Okay.
So even if nobody's there, the recording will be there. You know, if they find me dead in 3 days, shot in pieces in the lookouts, I'll know what day it happened. But nothing hit the tower, and 200 or 300 rounds later, they fired everything up and went roaring back down the entrance road and left.